You thought you were asking me the questions,
I
but I appreciate
know. Now you're turning this around. You're a man that see things that nobody else see. I know when you started the remote study, nobody thought about something like this. I called you crazy.
And I think my superpower wasn't that I could come up with a great idea, but that I could stitch together good ideas and hopefully make them great. How at different times in our journey, our collective journey to try to sustain progress in clinical research, different stakeholders need to step forward into the driver's seat. It was the FDA through CITI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, that created recommendations way back in 2018, before the pandemic, recommendations paper on decentralized trials. So that was really the regulators at the front of the cart.
Specialist to another. And guess what? My electronic data capture was my yellow notebook.
I will begin with a caveat that we can picture George Bush on the "This is now mission critical for pharma."
Hey, Craig, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have you here today and start the year with an interview with you.
Munther, I always enjoy a conversation with you, whether a camera is rolling or not. So this is absolutely a treat.
Thank you, man. I'm really honored to have you here with the person of your credentials, your resume, your CV, and what you've done in this industry, how you changed this industry. I am really super excited to be here with you.
That's kind of you to say, but most people should know that you were with me for every step of the way for just about anything positive that I was able to touch or help make happen as helping to lead a great team, whether within Pfizer when we were there together, or certainly in the journey since. So the pleasure, the honor is all mine, my friend.
Thank you, man. Thank you. It's really love having you here. Craig, I look at your journey and look how you got here. One of the experts says, or self-development coaches and experts says, 80% of students, they major on something and they end up with a different profession. I looked at your LinkedIn. It didn't say how you started. Did you start really in the health industry? Did you start in pharma? Would love to hear from you, your journey into where you are today.
Well, I absolutely am a key contributor to that percentage that you just cited. I majored in music and music theory as an undergraduate. And so I had a lot of time spent around the creative arts. Interestingly, when I put together that clinical innovation team at Pfizer, I remember we had one meeting where we went around the room and talked about what people majored in college. And it was fascinating how, and without it being a part of the design of the team or an expectation with hiring, how many of the folks in that room had undergraduate degrees and earlier career plans in the creative arts. And so this bridging of creative arts and science and technology, I think it kind of speaks to the STEM versus STEAM debate, right? Of how much of the arts blended in with our traditional STEM mindsets really brings a certain level of freshness and complementary thinking. So I did have some plans to practice in healthcare. Throughout college, I did work in EMS. And so I was working nights on ambulances around the metro Boston area when I was in college. Everyone else was going out for a good time that night. I went out in my steel-toed boots and my EMS uniform for the night and came back the next morning. Probably not having quite as much fun as some of the other college kids. But my journey led me to doing some epidemiologic research in Syracuse at the VA, and also doing some interesting observational research at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York, all while studying in public health and epidemiology. And I started to have the opportunity to work with some different studies that intersected with interventions with different therapeutics, initially around the field of acute stroke. And a lot of the research in stroke at the time, there were some interesting new drugs that people were experimenting with, but there were also interesting things happening with using imaging and digital tools to measure stroke better. And so I started getting drawn to this theme about using technology in drug development. I loved the idea of drug development. The economics, the pharmacoeconomics just seemed outrageous. How could it possibly cost this much money to develop a new medicine? But then taking new science and sort of having this Venn diagram with new and emerging technologies just was so exciting to me. And so my earliest work in that field was I started up a core lab, an imaging core lab business within Parexel. I was part of the team there. I didn't start it all myself. I was a kid, but I was their first project manager at the time. And in that business, we were very focused on stroke trials and using MRI to measure the ischemic penumbra. Using functional MRI, could we try and quantify not just the amount of brain that was irreparably damaged by the stroke, but could we actually quantify the recoverable tissue? And so in doing that, could we actually measure at baseline how much potentially recoverable tissue was there in the brain? And then following that patient over time, how much of that did this drug help the patient to actually recover? So it kind of normalized when people had really severe acute strokes that a lot of that damage was going to be unrecoverable, but how could we actually focus on what could be recovered? And that led me down this path of innovation and new measurements and digital tools.
Got it. Wow. But I mean, I look at this. This is amazing. This is, I guess, what create the passion and the excitement and what have you. But it
Well, what
look
about you, Munther? This is like your first episode. People are I'm sure equally curious. Well, how did you wind up in this field?
interesting. Um, in honesty, I came to the state in 1985, studied as a computer scientist, and I went and with the idea I'm gonna go back home to Jordan. And then I decided, to get married while I'm here and continue to live in the state and what have you. But as I'm working here in the state, I started working on manufacturing company, Honeywell Bull, basically at the time where we made mainframes, that in 1980, 1989. Eventually, to make the story short, I ended up working for a small CRO called MRI at the time, and that's how I get into the medical field. But the driver behind it really is my parents and my brother. I think you probably heard me talking about this. My father had diabetes. His quality of life kind of like went downhill as he lost his sight. His leg was amputated, and little by little, he was on bed for multiple years and what have you. And I really wanted to work for an industry that will make a difference. And that's why I think really I believe in pharma, and this is where I wake up every day thinking we're going to save the life of billions of people. That's really my driver, really getting here, basically.
It's beautiful.
Thanks.
Thanks for sharing, Munther. I know you thought you were asking me the questions,
I
but I
know.
appreciate
You're turning this around. But Craig, the idea also behind this channel is really to create excitement for newcomers to our industry. We've been in this industry where we talked about 10 to 12 years to get the drug out to the market, to get it to the patients, because at the end of the day, we want to get it sooner to the patients. And it's been a difficult journey. We spent $1.8 billion, failures. In COVID, we managed to do this in almost a year to get a drug out, or the vaccine, basically. So, I mean, This is the risk mitigation, I guess, right? How we got there. What can we do differently? You're a man that see things that nobody else see. I know when you started the remote study, nobody thought about something like this. I called you crazy. It's like, oh my God, how can you come up with those ideas? What's your thoughts there?
Well, I'll add one caveat. A lot of my journey, including at Pfizer, wasn't so much that I had great ideas. It's that I surrounded myself with a lot of people with a lot of different ideas. And I think my superpower wasn't that I could come up with a great idea, but that I could stitch together good ideas and hopefully make them great. Certainly that was the case with a lot of the work around the remote trial, around, a lot of good ideas that people were already experimenting with around patient centricity and engagement and different types of monitoring and other technologies. One thing I keep appreciating more and more right now, if let's build on your question about the pandemic. Things happen radically differently. So many different stakeholders seem to come together and align around doing things differently. And in some ways, where we are now feels like, for some, maybe we're sliding backwards. Maybe we're sliding way backwards,
Yeah.
given the current economic climate right now. It's a reminder to me, though, that how at different times in our journey, our collective journey to try to sustain progress in clinical research, different stakeholders need to step forward into the driver's seat, or be the one to pull the cart, or be the goose at the front of the V leading the way. So what do I mean by that? Prior to the pandemic, we had run that experiment at Pfizer with decentralized research, but it was the FDA through CITI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, that created recommendations way back in 2018, before the pandemic, recommendations paper on decentralized trials. So that was really the regulators at the front of the cart pulling.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, industry stepped to the front of the cart, right? Acute need to maintain clinical trial progress, to keep monitoring patients for safety, to sustain access to those investigational medicines and the data collection needed. And so industry was at the front, pulling and being the driving force. Pandemic starts to recede, maybe it's the regulators again, right, who around the world are issuing guidance documents and clarifications and making their positions clear on the ability for the community to keep using these innovative new measures. And where we are now in 2024 kind of feels like it's the academics now that are stepping forward and pulling the cart, right? That they're the ones who are now showing this incredible potential for decentralized research. The most ambitious trials that are happening right now using these methods are happening out of universities. And they're driven by investigators, not by industry. And so it's interesting for us to think about how we, the collective we, across different entities and stakeholders, need to step forward in order for the collective we to keep moving forward and maintaining progress.
Interesting perspective. I didn't think about it this way. So it feels like we paved the way, started with pharma, and then regulators took the lead with the regulation policy, etc. And then pharma stepped back in, and now it looks like the academic is doing it as well.
I will say a consistent force underneath all of those has been patients expressing, communicating consistently the burdens of research participation and the barriers that are represented across diverse patient communities. And so I think that's been a consistent force underneath, but it's clear that driving and maintaining progress year after year is really tough. And there are these instances where we have to hand off the baton for who's going to be kind of leading the charge. And right now, while industry is having certainly challenges in the current economy, more and more big pharma continue to contract, more and more of our biotechs continue to struggle looking for funding, that maybe this is the time that we have to lean even more on the creativity of some brilliant academics that are doing some incredible things.
Love that. You almost taking us right into like the insight into 2024, and you said a lot of things. It's what okay, so let's take my God, you put a lot of ideas in front of me as you're talking. But since you brought up the site and right now it seems like pharma also looks for the squeaky wheels, right? That needs the most oil, right? And you talked about the patient burden, and that's probably the driver why DCT will continue, because it's not, yes, when COVID hit, everybody, the stuff that we worked on 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and what have you, seems like impossible whenever there's no uptake and the scaling and what have you. In a sudden, that happened. And now everybody's thinking, well, the pandemic is over, then this whole DCT is gone, or what have you. And I think you bring a very important point. It's all about the patient. Can you talk a little bit from your perspective? I know this is your passion when we were at Pfizer. What drove everything? What drove you every day, I think, to work is what the patients need. Can you just elaborate a little bit more in that area?
First of all, it's an interesting observation just about the trends and who's in this particular space. At the DTRA annual meeting, maybe 2 years ago, maybe it was last year, Chuka Esiobu, who's an investor from Define Ventures, had used this phrase that, well, the tourists have left this industry. And that's really stuck with me, that, there were groups that were working on this space before it was cool. And then all of a sudden it felt like if you had the words DCT in your booth, you could generate meetings with clients. If you had the words DCT in your pitch deck, you could get momentum with investors. The folks that fluttered in and started using that term have now fluttered over to using AI and Gen AI in their booth and in their pitch decks. And they also had blockchain in it, 3 years ago. And I don't know what their words will be 2 years from now, but those tourists have left, and now it's folks doing the hard work. Now, to your point, when we did that first decentralized trial, I'll share, I had my own personal experience as a patient during my early career at Pfizer, where I was diagnosed with a pulmonary condition, pulmonary sarcoidosis. And I found just in the course of my own health management, the importance of my ability to own and manage my health data, moving from specialist to specialist and place to place. And it brought me very close to this community of e-patients, of patients who are friendly and familiar with technology, wanted access and control over their health data, and wanted to be partners in how decisions were made. And so it was a lot of that e-patient movement and mindset that was on my mind when we were designing that remote trial. So I brought into our Pfizer New York office during that planning stage a friend of mine, Dave DeBronkart, affectionately known on the internet as e-patient Dave, one of the early pioneers of the e-patient movement. And
Amazing guy.
Right, generously came into New York to spend, a day with our teams, sharing his story, listening to our work. Now, Dave came all the way down. I remember saying, well, I want to take advantage of this guy while he's here. Let me make some other meetings while he's here. Now, keep in mind, this is 19 years ago, 18 years ago. So this is quite a few minutes ago, right? And at the time, every leader I would talk to around Pfizer at the time would say to me, well, what do you want me to tell this guy? What do you want me to tell this patient, right? Nobody had the mindset of, what am I going to learn from a patient? Back then, all of our mindset was, if a patient's coming in, what am I supposed to be explaining or teaching them or telling them? Right. And look at how our industry has evolved. I know it takes a long time to make change happen, especially culture and mindset. But today, if I said in most companies, Pfizer, other large ones, medium-sized ones, let's bring Dave DeBronkart, an e-patient leader, in, people would get it. They'd know, this is a time for us to shut up and listen and learn and engage. It's not, what am I supposed to tell this patient, like it was way back then.
Yeah, man, this is amazing. I recall when we started working on the blockchain and we had an industry meeting in Pfizer in Cambridge. If you remember, the patient, she was sitting in front of us, And she said, I had to go from one doctor to another, from one specialist to another. And guess what? My electronic data capture was my yellow notebook. So she'll have to go and take that yellow notebook, open it, and talk to one, because they didn't have the full story. They didn't have the ability for, to move data around or what have you. And this is when we thought at the time blockchain is really the solution to help basically move data around securely with the consent of the patient, who can see and when and how long they can look at their data. Yeah. But you're
Especially when we're thinking about permission layers wrapped around that. Because it's one thing to say, let's make sure a patient can access and control their data. And that's certainly important. But think about the analogy of like your credit report in the US. For those of us in the US, we all know there's a credit report from a credit bureau and there's a score, a FICO score attached to my credit report. Now, I want access to my credit report, but I'm not looking at my credit report every day. What I want to do is share my credit report in ways that do me good. Right? So I want a loan for a car. I want to be able to control and share my credit report and have confidence in its authenticity and integrity so that I can share it and something positive can happen as a result. In a lot of ways, that's the power of making sure that people have access and control over their health data. Now, it might mean I want the ability to share it with other providers or care teams or second opinions. It might mean I want to share it with an app or an intelligent app that's going to add other insights and bring other data together. People often raise this, right? Who wants to look at their health data? But the beauty with your mindset that you had around a blockchain layer, to me, like, yes, getting access to your data is good, but having trusted ways to be able to share that data in other places is what's beautiful.
Yeah, that's it's amazing. I was asked once, like, why blockchain didn't take off and why did ChatGPT take off, for example. And I was looking back, our industry, 1993, the biggest thing that happened in technology for us was the internet, right? 2007, the iPhone came about, and 2020 is ChatGPT. So why every CEO, executive, student talk ChatGPT, but they didn't talk a blockchain? And I thought the answer was very simple. It was easy for them to put their hands on it, and it was easy for them to become immediately productive. I thought that was key.
I think you said it exactly right. LLMs existed before ChatGPT, right? Those large language models. ChatGPT put a user interface on this that made it incredibly accessible, almost playful. Think about it, right? I'll enter something into ChatGPT and it almost like pretends like it's thinking, and and I'll watch the words populate as if it's like some human across from me that's actually thinking. These are like gaming elements that are built into ChatGPT to make it almost this playful experience for the user. It's funny, like the experience is almost so simple that we almost ignore it, right? We're not taken by the user experience of ChatGPT, but that user experience, I think, is what made a very complex technology accessible. And we never really had that user experience layer for blockchain that made it feel accessible. Instead, all we had were these words about a distributed ledger and smart contracts and things that felt ethereal. And the only like really tangible use case we could point to was Bitcoin, which isn't even understandable or that accessible from a user interface. I need a wallet. What are these things I
I
need,
have
right?
no idea. My digital wallet got stolen. Oh my God.
I don't even know, like, what are we even talking about? But you're right, that interface with ChatGPT, and now even with these other types of LLM interfaces for rendering images and so on,
Did you
they've
try
made
that?
it so simple.
Did you try the images?
Oh yeah, now a lot of my LinkedIn posts, like that post that I did with 5 predictions for the new year, every one of those images
So you did the
was
black and
LLM
white and
generated.
Fuji. Okay, all right.
I might have played with them afterward just to sort of normalize the look and feel so that it sort of had consistency, but absolutely, yeah.
Well, speaking of which, let's dive into your insights into 2024. Your You're very well known in this industry. You've been around, you've seen things, you predicted certain things, the stuff that you worked on, and others that you drove with our colleagues. You started DFARM, you started DTRA, and it was just it kind of like it took off, and with the whole disruptive innovation and what have you. Now, we're pandemic is behind us, and we're getting into 2024. You talked about the economic challenges, and you started your predictions talking about the side question, and if the love is real, so, and you predicted that there's a shift, from patient centricity to site centricity in clinical trials. Can you elaborate, and what's the implication, of this shift, and what have you?
I will begin with a caveat that there is the way that I feel the world should be, and there is the way that I think the world will be, at least in the very near term. Should pharma consistently engage with sites and remain committed to their relationship with sites as peers? Absolutely. But will they? I'm not so sure. And I think it's very easy for some in the site community to say, mission accomplished. And I chose those words carefully, right? So that we can picture George Bush on the deck of an aircraft carrier with a mission accomplished banner, a little premature, right? And so I think it's very easy for us to think mission accomplished. Look at the way sponsors are engaging in better and smarter ways with sites. That's only going to continue. It's the right thing. But why are pharma companies engaging in this way? And in large part, it's because there's been a crisis at sites that's only gotten to a point of mission critical for them, critical path for them. Now, it's not a new crisis. ACRP and others have been raising the prospects of a resourcing and staffing crisis for years. But this is through the pandemic, and the great resignation and turnover in healthcare is now a crisis to sponsors because sites can't take on new studies. I was on the phone the other day with the CEO of a biotech company developing in a certain indication that disproportionately affects Black women in America. And he has no sites in the metro New York area because none of them have capacity to take on his study. It's mind-boggling. So we can do all of this work with digital and data and say this is where our studies should operate. But if the sites are in a resourcing crunch, this is now mission critical for pharma, and so it's getting disproportionate attention. Now, some will say that resourcing and staffing are going to normalize this year in healthcare and at the research sites as well. If and when that happens, sites are no longer the squeaky wheel. And what I think we have to anticipate is pharma teams will resource the next crisis and the next squeaky wheel. If sites want to maintain that attention, I guess there are two strategies: keep being the squeaky wheel, or how else do you instantiate yourself as a persistent force so that that attention doesn't all, and all those resources don't all flutter away to the next problem.
Well, let's dive a little bit here, Craig, because that squeaky wheel always like this. I always hear it in my back of my head because it started. Before we did not include the patient and the sites. We gave them the protocol, we gave them computers and what have you. And then, as you said it, we brought the patient into pharma, and then the whole question and how we're gonna interact, it changed the dynamics and what have you. So what can pharma do differently? Why do we have to always to swing 180 degree or the other side? Oh, now we need to pay to the attention to the patient. Let's talk about optionality. Let's make sure that we ask the patients the questions. Does this design work? Does it really, and then we were originally focused on the sites, and then we left the site alone. It just like this extreme, I think, gets us where we are today. What's your
I
take?
mean, decentralized adoption was because there was a squeaky wheel, right? The pandemic created a crisis around business continuity for trials,
Yeah.
and DCTs were the WD-40 for that squeaky wheel. Now, how does this industry get past that? This may not be a popular view, but our industry doesn't have 5-year investment horizons when it comes to innovation in our process. We have 1 to 2 year budget cycles. And as a result, we don't really have good long-term commitment to meaningful change over time. It all trickles down to this very transactional nature with our DevOps budgets, our development org budgets. It's very transaction oriented around investing in individual studies with budgets with lots of contracted third parties, and it doesn't leave a lot of room for long-term investments, consistent budget access. I think our DevOps leaders are good, smart people. They'd like to see change happen, but they don't have that multi-year, multi-horizon investment opportunity.
Yeah, it seems like the election every 4 years we get a new president, and it looks like I saw some stats like it's around the globe. We're gonna get a lot of new presidents, next year. So, the leadership I think is gonna change by 40 to 60% around the globe. So it's gonna be interesting where
Hey,
this
some of these large pharma, if they had 4 years with their leadership, that would be a win. It's almost like, they're on a midterm cycle of, every 2 years. And how much commitment to a strategy can you really make happen in 2 to 3 years? You could really, at best, only go after incremental things. And it sort of keeps us trapped in this addressing just the fires.
Interesting. So, one of the things I love about DTRA, the organization you started with Dr. Amir Khalili, Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance. When you both of us worked with different nonprofit organizations, one of the hardest thing was getting in, and whether you're part of pharma or not, whether you're a vendor or not, you're a site or not, or you're a patient or not. I think you guys talk a little bit about how did you get into the mind of starting this, and then maybe what can DTRA do as well for the industry, kind of like to basically avoid being extreme here or there to help the industry, because you brought up so many great minds together to network all these power brains from pharma, from small biotech, vendors, patients, sites are sitting around the same table talking and then coming up with solutions, what have you. Can you elaborate a little bit more there? Because I think there's a huge benefits there.
The that DTRA story, even prior to the pandemic, we had all of these panel sessions at conferences with people from tech and pharma and other stakeholders talking about decentralized research well before COVID-19. And each time there would be great conversation with interesting people and maybe some cool ideas formed, but then we'd all part ways and wait for the next conference, maybe see you next year at CNS Summit or some other meeting where we would reconvene, share some opportunities for what we could be doing together, and then go our separate ways. And so there was already this kindling of what if we could have a collaboration space even prior to the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, we actually cooled off on moving forward with DTRA because all the people that we had been talking to were pretty busy, heads down, sustaining portfolios and getting work done. And so we were able to rekindle DTRA with those folks by later that year after even though it was mid-pandemic. I think out of the gate, because Amir and I have worked in very different types of organizations, whether academia, CRO, tech, pharma, biotech, we had this appreciation that a multi-stakeholder approach would be what's needed here. I've been of the mindset, you and I worked with Transcelerate in its earliest days, projects with IMI, City, and others.
Yep.
Different initiatives are chartered in different ways to get different things done, right? So SCRS with a focus on the site, Transcelerate being, a group of the DevOps of the pharma organizations. These types of organizations have a key role to play, bringing alignment and getting some cool collaborative work done for that stakeholder group. Others like City or IMI are more diverse in their constituents. And I think that's the gap that we were missing that DTRA was looking to fill. And so today, our membership, our health systems, our biotech and pharma, our site networks and advocacy groups, tech service providers, and beyond. And that could be a liability at times, because you'll have one stakeholder that may feel something is pre-competitive, that another stakeholder feels, well, actually, that's my secret sauce. That to a sponsor, they may look and say, well, we should be sharing this SOP or process. And to a CRO, they'd say, that's verboten. That's like how we operate. And that's what's special for us compared to our peers. Fortunately, with DTRA, we really haven't run into those issues. And we found time and again these opportunities for shared solutions.
Nice. Let me put a plug for DTRA.org. I think you guys done a wonderful job in terms bringing resources together into one centralized location. Jane did a fantastic job with the tube stop, and that really outlines from the beginning, from the study startup all the way to the closure of the study. And there's different stops where you click on and it tells you what do you need to get there, what's going to happen, and what's the output from there, all these different artifacts. And what I loved also, like, I know there's part of us that in pharma, we love to be perfectionism, right? And we're like, let's have a good enough with all the resources and how it works. And we open the gate for people to come in and say, contribute. Like if we're missing something, give us a comment, etc. I thought that was fantastic. You guys done a great job in that. In that.
It's such a dynamic field, and there'll be new resources and new recommendations in different areas. But one thing that I think Jane Miles has done really well with that tube stop map is it doesn't just include DTRA work and solutions, which it could have. We have plenty of things that teams have developed, but to link in with Transcelerate, SCRS, ACRP, MRCT, ACRO, IEEE, IMI, the list goes on and on of great collaborations doing important work. But how do we make sure that good solutions are available and can be found? And so we've really tried to create one destination that the research community can turn to for solutions, regardless of where they're coming from.
That's I'm really proud to be part of that team. It's an amazing team that love it.
Well, it's a team and it's a community of leaders, and it's without those leaders, those individuals like yourself, it doesn't work.
Thank you.